The morning sun cast long shadows across Meadowbrook Cemetery as mourners gathered around two small white caskets. Sarah Mitchell stood between her husband David and her mother, clutching a handful of wilted daisies that had once brightened her kitchen windowsill. The flowers seemed fitting somehow, beautiful things that had withered too soon, just like her twin daughters, Emma and Lily. The twins had been born 3 months premature, fighting for every breath in the neonatal intensive. For 42 days, Sarah and David had lived between hope and despair, watching their tiny daughters struggle against machines that seemed bigger than they were. The hospital had become their second home, with its sterile hallways and the constant beeping of monitors that had become the soundtrack to their new reality. Dr. Peterson had been honest from the beginning. The girls faced serious complications from their early arrival. Emma, the smaller of the two, had underdeveloped lungs that struggled to process oxygen. Lily appeared stronger initially, but her heart showed signs of defects that would require multiple surgeries. The medical team worked tirelessly, but premature birth often brought challenges that modern medicine could only do so much to overcome. Sarah remembered the last night she spent with her daughters. She had been reading them a story about brave little rabbits who went on adventures together. Emma's tiny hand had wrapped around her finger with surprising strength, while Lily seemed to listen intently to every word. The nurse had commented on how alert they both seemed that evening, how their vital signs had been more stable than they had been in weeks. The call came at 3 a.m. David answered the phone with shaking hands while Sarah sat up in bed, already knowing what the conversation would bring. Dr. Peterson's voice was gentle but clear. Emma had taken a turn for the worse during the night. Her breathing had become labored, and despite the medical team's best efforts, her little body had simply grown too tired to continue fighting. They rushed to the hospital, where they found Lily alone in the incubator that had housed both girls for so many weeks. The staff had moved Emma to a private room where Sarah and David could hold their daughter for the first time, without wires and tubes. She was so small, so peaceful, looking as if she were simply sleeping after a long day of play. The next 72 hours passed in a blur of decisions no parent should have to make. Funeral arrangements, choosing clothes that would fit their tiny daughter, selecting flowers for a service that felt impossible to plan. Through it all, Lily remained in the NICU, and the doctors assured them she was responding well to treatment. There was hope that she might be strong enough to come home within a few weeks. The funeral home had been kind beyond measure. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had been helping families through their darkest moments for over 20 years, had guided them through every detail with patience and compassion. She had suggested they could wait to have a service for both girls if they wished, but Sarah felt strongly that Emma deserved to be honored immediately. They would deal with whatever came next when the time arrived. On the morning of Emma's funeral, an unexpected call came from the hospital. Lily had experienced complications during the night. Her heart, which had seemed to be growing stronger, had suddenly begun showing signs of severe distress. The surgical team was preparing for an emergency procedure, but Dr. Peterson wanted the family to come immediately. Sarah stood in the hospital hallway, still wearing her black dress from Emma's service, unable to comprehend how their world could crumble so completely in such a short time. David paced the floor, his suit jacket wrinkled from hours of waiting. Their family members, who had come to support them through Emma's funeral, now found themselves keeping vigil once again. The surgery lasted 4 hours. Dr. Peterson emerged looking exhausted, pulling off his surgical cap as he approached the waiting family. Lily had fought bravely, but her tiny heart had simply been too damaged to repair. She had passed away peacefully on the operating table, surrounded by medical professionals who had grown to love her during her short stay in their care. Now, just 5 days after Emma's service, they found themselves back at Meadowbrook Cemetery. The funeral director had arranged for both caskets to be placed side by side, exactly as the twins had been positioned in their shared incubator. White roses covered both caskets, with pink ribbons that Sarah had chosen because the girls had worn matching pink hats during their hospital stay. Pastor William spoke about the brief but meaningful lives the twins had lived, how they had brought joy to everyone who had cared for them, even during their short time on Earth. He talked about the love that Sarah and David had poured into their daughters, how that love would continue even though the girls were no longer with them physically. The cemetery was surprisingly full. Nurses from the NICU had come to pay their respects, along with neighbors, family friends, and people from their church community. Many of these people had followed the twins' journey through social media updates that Sarah had shared during their hospital stay. The girls had touched more lives than their parents had realized. As the service concluded, mourners began to file past the caskets to pay their final respects. Sarah watched through tears as people who had become invested in her daughter's survival said their goodbyes. Mrs. Chen from next door left a small teddy bear between the caskets. Nurse Jennifer, who had worked the night shift and had sung lullabies to both girls, placed a children's book about stars beside the flowers. The cemetery, workers waited respectfully at a distance, giving the family time to say their private goodbyes. Sarah knelt between the two caskets, whispering promises to her daughters that she would never forget them, that their short lives had mattered immensely, and that she would carry their memory with her always. David placed his hands on both caskets, simultaneously, his shoulders shaking as he struggled to maintain composure. This was supposed to be the end of their story, a tragic but final conclusion to a journey that had brought such hope and such devastating loss. None of them could have imagined that their goodbye was about to become something entirely different. The funeral service had ended, and most of the mourners had slowly made their way back to their cars, leaving the immediate family to share a few final moments with Emma and Lily. Sarah's mother, Helen, stood quietly beside her daughter, occasionally reaching out to squeeze her hand when the tears became too overwhelming. David's brother Mark had driven down from Chicago and stood with his arm around David's shoulders, offering the kind of support that didn't require words. As the cemetery workers began to approach with their equipment, Sarah felt a desperate need to delay the inevitable. These were her babies, and once they were lowered into the ground, the finality would be complete. She asked for just a few more minutes, and the workers nodded respectfully, stepping back to give the family space. It was during this quiet moment that something unusual happened. Mrs. Rodriguez, the funeral director who had been so helpful throughout this ordeal, approached the family with a concerned expression. She had been coordinating with the cemetery staff and had discovered what she called a procedural issue that needed immediate attention. The cemetery records showed that the plot they had selected and paid for was actually reserved for someone else. The administrative error had somehow gone unnoticed until the burial crew arrived and double-checked their paperwork against the cemetery's master records. There was another family who had purchased this specific location months earlier. For their own future use, Mrs. Rodriguez was mortified. In her 20 years of service, she had never encountered such a mistake. The cemetery manager, Mr. Thompson, had been called immediately and was driving over to resolve the situation personally. However, this meant that the burial would need to be postponed until they could locate and prepare an appropriate alternative site. Sarah felt as if the ground beneath her feet had shifted. How could there be a mistake at such a critical moment? David's face flushed with anger, not at Mrs. Rodriguez, who was clearly as upset as they were, but at the cruel timing of such an administrative error. They had already endured more than any parents should have to face, and now they couldn't even lay their daughters to rest without complications. Mr. Thompson arrived within 20 minutes, a tall man in his 60s who had managed Meadowbrook Cemetery for over 30 years. He apologized profusely, explaining that they had recently switched to a new computer system for tracking plot sales, and somehow the twins' information had been entered incorrectly. He assured them that the cemetery would cover all additional costs and would personally oversee the preparation of a new site. The problem was that preparing a new burial site would take several hours. The ground would need to be properly excavated, and they wanted to ensure everything was done correctly this time. Mr. Thompson suggested they could either wait at the cemetery or return home and come back later in the day for a private burial service. Sarah couldn't bear the thought of leaving her daughters again. They had already been through so much separation during the girls' time in the hospital, with visiting hours and medical procedures that kept parents at a distance. She insisted that they would wait, regardless of how long it took. The cemetery, provided a small chapel where the family could sit comfortably while the work was being done. The caskets were moved to a climate-controlled holding area, and Mrs. Rodriguez assured them that the girls would be treated with the utmost respect during the delay. She also called the pastor to let him know about the situation, in case he wanted to return for the delayed burial. As they settled into the chapel, family members began sharing memories of the twins that hadn't been included in the formal service. Helen talked about how excited she had been to become a grandmother to twins, how she had already begun knitting matching blankets in soft yellow since they hadn't known the babies' genders at first. Mark shared how David had called him the night the girls were born, crying with joy and exhaustion as he described holding both daughters for the first time. David's sister Lisa, who lived in California and had flown in for the funeral, showed them pictures on her phone of the nursery she had started preparing at her house. She had hoped the twins might visit during holidays, and she had wanted to be ready with cribs, toys, and everything two little girls might need during their stays. These conversations, while painful, also brought a strange comfort. The delay, which had initially felt like another cruel twist in their story, was giving them time to process their grief together in a way that the formal funeral service hadn't allowed. They were sharing stories, crying openly, and supporting each other through the raw emotions that came with such profound loss. Around noon, Mrs. Rodriguez brought them updates from Mr. Thompson. The new plot had been selected in a beautiful section of the cemetery that overlooked a small pond. It was actually a more peaceful location than their original site, surrounded by old oak trees that provided natural shade. The excavation was proceeding smoothly, and they expected to be ready for the burial by early afternoon. During the wait, something unexpected happened that would later seem like a sign. A young woman named Maria Santos arrived at the cemetery to visit her son's grave. She had lost her baby boy to complications similar to what the twins had faced, and she had been following Sarah and David's story through mutual friends who worked at the hospital. Maria had brought flowers to place at the twins' new gravesite, not knowing about the delay. When she learned what was happening, she asked if she could sit with the family for a while. Her presence brought a different kind of comfort. She understood their loss in a way that others couldn't, having walked a similar path herself. Maria told them about the support group she had found for parents who had lost infants. She described how connecting with other parents who understood their experience had been crucial to her healing process. She didn't push or pressure them to join anything, but she wanted them to know that resources existed when they felt ready to reach out. As the afternoon progressed, more unexpected visitors arrived. Dr. Peterson and several nurses from the NICU came by during their lunch break to check on the family. They had heard about the delay and wanted to offer additional support. Seeing these medical professionals who had fought so hard to save the twins, taking time from their busy schedules to be present during this difficult day, reinforced how many lives Emma and Lily had touched. Nurse Jennifer, who had been particularly close to the twins during their NICU stay, sat with Sarah and shared stories about the girls' personalities that had emerged even during their short lives. Emma had been a fighter who seemed to get stronger when her sister was near. Lily had been incredibly alert, tracking voices and seeming to recognize her parents' touch even through the medical equipment. These details, which might have been lost in the chaos of medical procedures and difficult decisions, now became precious memories. The delay was allowing people to share aspects of the twins' lives that the formal funeral service hadn't captured. Emma and Lily were being remembered not just as babies who had died, but as individuals who had lived, even if briefly, as the afternoon sun began to cast longer shadows across the cemetery grounds. Mr. Thompson finally approached the chapel with good news. The new site was ready, and everything had been prepared exactly as originally planned. The burial could proceed whenever the family felt ready. But something had changed during those hours of waiting. What had begun as a frustrating delay had transformed into an unexpected gift of time. Time to grieve together, to share memories, and to feel the love and support of a community that had rallied around their family during the darkest period of their lives. The new burial site was everything Mr. Thompson had promised and more. Located near the center of the cemetery, the plot sat beneath two magnificent oak trees whose branches created a natural canopy. A small stone bench had been positioned nearby, and the view stretched across a peaceful pond where ducks swam lazily in the afternoon sun. Sarah immediately felt that this location was meant for her daughters. It was serene, beautiful, and somehow felt more appropriate than their original choice. The cemetery crew had worked with incredible care to prepare the site. The grass around the area had been meticulously maintained, and they had even planted small clusters of white flowers around the perimeter. Mrs. Rodriguez explained that this was the cemetery's way of apologizing for the earlier confusion, though no apology could undo the emotional stress the delay had caused. Pastor Williams had returned for the private burial service, along with most of the family members who had waited throughout the afternoon. The NICU staff had to return to work, but they had left flowers and personal notes that would be buried with the twins. Dr. Peterson had written a letter to Emma and Lily, thanking them for teaching him about courage and resilience during their brief but impactful lives. As they gathered around the new gravesite, Sarah noticed something that made her pause. There was another small grave nearby, marked with a headstone that read, "Baby Santos, forever in our hearts." She realized this was where Maria's son was, buried, and the proximity felt like more than mere coincidence. Their babies would rest near each other, and their families had found connection through shared grief. The second burial service was more intimate than the morning's formal ceremony. Pastor Williams spoke about how the delay had allowed them to see God's hand working in unexpected ways, bringing people together and providing comfort during a time of immense sorrow. He reflected on how the twins' story was touching lives even after their death, creating connections and community among people who might never have met otherwise. Sarah and David each placed a small toy in the caskets before they were lowered. For Emma, Sarah chose a tiny stuffed rabbit that she had bought during her pregnancy, imagining future bedtime stories. For Lily, David placed a small music box that played a lullaby he had hummed to both girls during their hospital stays. These personal items felt important, tokens of the love and dreams they had carried for their daughters. As the caskets were gently lowered into the ground, something beautiful happened. The ducks from the nearby pond began swimming closer to the shore, as if drawn by the gathering. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves of the oak trees, creating a soft rustling sound that felt like nature's own blessing on the ceremony. Sarah found these small details comforting, as if the natural world was acknowledging the significance of this moment. The burial concluded as the sun began to set, casting a golden light across the cemetery. Family members took turns placing handfuls of soil on the caskets, each person saying a silent goodbye. Sarah was the last to participate in this ritual, and as she released the earth from her hands, she whispered a promise that she would visit often, and that she would never forget the brief but precious time she had been their mother. After the burial, the family gathered at Sarah and David's home for a meal that had been prepared by church members. The house felt different now, quieter, emptier, despite being filled with people who loved them. The nursery door remained closed, and Sarah wasn't ready to think about what to do with the room that had been prepared with such hope and excitement. Over the following weeks, the reality of life without the twins began to set in. Well-meaning friends and family members often struggled with what to say. Some avoided mentioning the babies altogether, thinking this would be less painful, while others wanted to share every memory they had of the brief time the twins had been alive. Sarah and David found themselves navigating a world that didn't seem designed for parents who had lost children. The support group that Maria had mentioned became a lifeline. Sarah began attending meetings 2 weeks after the burial, finding comfort in connecting with other parents who understood the unique grief that comes with losing a baby. The group met in the basement of a local church, and despite the sad circumstances that brought them together, there was genuine warmth and understanding among the members. David initially resisted the idea of the support group, preferring to process his grief privately. He threw himself into work, staying late at the office and taking on extra projects that kept his mind occupied. Sarah worried that they were grieving differently and that this might create distance between them when they needed each other most. The cemetery became a place of solace for Sarah. She visited Emma and Lily's grave several times each week, often bringing fresh flowers or small decorations that marked holidays and seasons. She had purchased a small garden spade and began planting perennial flowers around the headstone. The physical act of gardening, of creating something beautiful in this place of loss, provided a therapeutic outlet for her grief. During one of her visits, about a month after the burial, Sarah encountered an elderly woman who was tending to a nearby grave. The woman, who introduced herself as Eleanor, had been visiting her husband's grave for over 15 years. She had noticed Sarah's regular visits and wanted to offer encouragement from someone who understood the importance of these cemetery rituals. Eleanor shared wisdom that she had gained through her own journey with loss. She talked about how grief comes in waves, sometimes manageable and sometimes overwhelming, but that it gradually becomes less consuming over time. She emphasized that there was no timeline for healing, and that everyone's path through grief looked different. These conversations with Eleanor became another source of comfort. The older woman had a gentle way of sharing her perspective without offering empty platitudes or trying to minimize Sarah's pain. She understood that losing a spouse after decades of marriage was different from losing babies who had barely begun their lives, but she also recognized that grief, in all its forms, required patience, support, and time. As autumn approached, Sarah and David made a decision that surprised their family and friends. They decided to organize a small memorial event at the cemetery to mark what would have been the twins' 3-month birthday. They invited everyone who had been part of the girls' story: the medical staff, family members, friends, and the other parents from the support group. The event was simple but meaningful. They released white balloons into the evening sky, each balloon carrying a written message to Emma and Lily. Pastor Williams offered a brief blessing, and several people shared memories or thoughts about how the twins had impacted their lives. Maria spoke about how meeting Sarah and David had helped her own healing process and how their daughters had brought people together in unexpected ways. Dr. Peterson attended the memorial and brought news that would have seemed impossible during those dark days in the NICU. The hospital had received a large donation from an anonymous benefactor to fund new equipment for the neonatal unit. The donor had specifically requested that the equipment be dedicated in memory of Emma and Lily Mitchell, and a small plaque would be installed recognizing their brief but meaningful lives. This news brought tears to Sarah's eyes, but for the first time since losing the twins, they were tears that contained elements of joy alongside the sadness. Her daughters' lives had mattered. Their story was continuing to make a difference for other families who would face similar challenges. The twins' legacy was growing beyond anything she could have imagined during those desperate days when she was simply praying for them to survive. 6 months had passed since the burial when Sarah received a phone call that would change everything she thought she knew about her daughter's story. She was in the kitchen preparing dinner when her phone rang, displaying a number she didn't recognize. Normally, she would have let unknown calls go to voicemail, but something prompted her to answer. The voice on the other end belonged to Dr. Patricia Reeves, a forensic pathologist who worked with the state medical examiner's office. Dr. Reeves explained that she was calling about Emma and Lily Mitchell, and Sarah's heart immediately began racing. She couldn't imagine why a forensic pathologist would be contacting her about her daughters who had died from complications related to premature birth. Dr. Reeves spoke carefully, explaining that the medical examiner's office had been conducting a routine audit of infant deaths at several hospitals in the state. This audit was part of a larger investigation into potential medical malpractice, and they had requested tissue samples from various cases to conduct additional testing using newer, more advanced techniques. Sarah felt confused and slightly defensive. Dr. Peterson and his team had been wonderful throughout the twins' ordeal. They had been honest about the challenges, compassionate in their care, and had clearly done everything possible to save both girls. She couldn't understand why their case would be part of any investigation. Dr. Reeves assured her that the hospital wasn't under suspicion of wrongdoing. The audit was primarily focused on a different facility, but they were examining cases from multiple hospitals to establish baseline data and ensure consistent standards of care. However, the additional testing they had conducted on samples from Emma and Lily had revealed some unexpected findings that needed to be discussed. The pathologist requested a meeting with Sarah and David at their convenience. She emphasized that this wasn't urgent in terms of any immediate action needed, but the information was significant enough that it shouldn't be shared over the phone. Sarah felt a growing sense of unease as she scheduled the appointment for the following week. When she told David about the call that evening, he initially reacted with skepticism and concern. They had been gradually finding their footing after months of grief, and the idea of reopening questions about their daughter's deaths felt overwhelming. David worried that some bureaucratic investigation might diminish or complicate the closure they had slowly begun to achieve. The meeting took place at Dr. Reeves's office in the State Medical Building downtown. The pathologist was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor that immediately put Sarah at ease. She had prepared a comprehensive file and had requested that Dr. Peterson join them via phone conference to provide medical context for the discussion. Dr. Reeves began by explaining the sophisticated testing methods that hadn't been available 6 months earlier. Advances in genetic analysis and tissue examination could now detect certain conditions and causes of death that might have been missed using traditional autopsy procedures. The testing was primarily being used to improve medical protocols and training for future cases. The findings regarding Emma were consistent with what they had already known. Her underdeveloped lungs and respiratory complications were exactly as Dr. Peterson had diagnosed and explained to the family. The additional testing confirmed that everything possible had been done to treat her condition, and that her death had been the result of challenges commonly associated with extreme premature birth. However, the results for Lily were unexpected and would require careful explanation. Dr. Reeves paused before continuing, clearly choosing her words thoughtfully. The advanced genetic testing had revealed that Lily had not actually died from the heart condition that had been identified during her hospital stay. Instead, she had suffered from an extremely rare metabolic disorder that had gone undetected. Sarah felt as if the room was spinning. Dr. Peterson's voice came through the speakerphone, expressing his own surprise at these findings. He explained that the metabolic disorder Dr. Reeves had identified was so rare that it affected fewer than 1 in several million births. The symptoms often mimicked heart problems, and the condition couldn't be diagnosed with the standard tests that had been available during Lily's treatment. More importantly, and this was the information that Dr. Reeves had felt needed to be shared in person, this particular metabolic disorder was potentially treatable if diagnosed early. The treatment involved a specific combination of medications and nutritional supplements that could manage the condition and allow affected children to live relatively normal lives. The silence in the room stretched for several long minutes as Sarah and David tried to process this information. Dr. Reeves gently explained that even if they had known about Lily's actual condition during her hospital stay, there was no guarantee that treatment would have been successful given her premature birth and other complications. However, there was a reasonable possibility that she might have survived with appropriate intervention. David's reaction was immediate and intense. He wanted to know why more comprehensive testing hadn't been done initially, why this rare condition hadn't been considered, and whether Dr. Peterson and his team had somehow failed their daughter. Dr. Peterson, still connected by phone, patiently explained that the condition was so rare that most pediatric specialists would never encounter it during their entire careers. Dr. Reeves added that the genetic markers for this disorder had only been identified within the past 2 years, and the testing protocols were still being developed and implemented in major medical centers. Even if they had suspected this condition, the specific tests needed to confirm it hadn't been widely available 6 months ago. Sarah found herself caught between grief and anger, but also a strange sense of relief. For months she had wondered if there was something more they could have done, some treatment they hadn't tried, some specialist they hadn't consulted. Now she was learning that there might have been something, but it was something that no one could reasonably have been expected to know about at the time. The meeting concluded with Dr. Reeves providing them with detailed medical reports and offering to connect them with genetic counselors who could explain the implications for any future pregnancies. She also mentioned that their case would be included in medical literature to help educate doctors about this rare condition, potentially helping other families avoid similar tragedies. As they drove home, Sarah and David rode in silence for most of the trip. Finally, David spoke, expressing frustration that felt almost like betrayal. He felt as if they had been given false closure, that the peace they had slowly built around their daughter's deaths had been disrupted by information that changed nothing but somehow changed everything. Sarah understood his feelings, but her own reaction was more complex. Part of her felt angry that Lily might have been saved, but another part felt oddly comforted by the knowledge that their daughter's condition had been so rare and unusual that missing the diagnosis was understandable rather than negligent. That evening, Sarah called Maria from the support group to talk through her emotions. Maria listened carefully and then shared her own perspective as someone who had navigated similar feelings when she learned new information about her son's death, months after his burial. She reminded Sarah that this new knowledge didn't diminish the love they had shown their daughters or the quality of care they had received. Over the following days, Sarah found herself returning frequently to the cemetery. She sat by Emma and Lily's grave, talking to them about this new information and trying to process how it fit into the story she had constructed about their lives and deaths. The oak trees above their grave were beginning to show the first signs of spring growth, and she took some comfort in these visible signs of renewal and continuation. Dr. Peterson called several times to check on how they were handling the news. He explained that he had spent considerable time researching the metabolic disorder and consulting with specialists around the country. He wanted them to understand that even with current knowledge and testing capabilities, diagnosing this condition in a premature infant would remain extremely challenging. The medical community was learning from cases like Lily's, and protocols were being developed to include screening for rare metabolic disorders in certain high-risk situations. Dr. Peterson assured them that their daughter's cases were contributing to medical knowledge that would benefit other families, which aligned with the legacy Sarah had hoped Emma and Lily might leave behind. The revelation about Lily's true condition created an unexpected rift in how Sarah and David processed their grief. While Sarah found herself cautiously hopeful that this knowledge might help other families, David became increasingly consumed with questions about what might have been. He began researching the metabolic disorder obsessively, reading medical journals late into the night and contacting specialists around the country to understand more about treatment options. This difference in their coping mechanisms became a source of tension in their marriage. Sarah worried that David was torturing himself with hypothetical scenarios, while David felt that Sarah was too quick to accept what he saw as a preventable tragedy. Their conversations about the twins, which had previously brought them closer, together in their shared grief, now often ended in arguments or uncomfortable silences. 3 weeks after the meeting with Dr. Reeves, David made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him. He announced that he was taking a leave of absence from his job to pursue formal training in genetic counseling. He had contacted several universities and found a program that would allow him to study the rare metabolic disorders that affected infants. Sarah initially thought this was another manifestation of David's grief-driven obsession with their daughter's medical conditions. However, as David explained his reasoning, she began to understand that this was his way of creating meaning from their loss. He wanted to become someone who could help other families navigate the complex genetic testing and counseling that might prevent similar tragedies. The decision required significant financial sacrifice. David's leave of absence was unpaid, and the counseling program required full-time commitment for 18 months. Sarah would need to return to work earlier than planned, and they would have to carefully manage their expenses during this transition period. However, they had received some financial relief from an unexpected source: the anonymous donation that had funded new NICU equipment in memory of Emma, and Lily had been accompanied by an additional gift specifically for Sarah and David. The donor had established a small trust fund to help cover expenses related to any educational or advocacy work they might want to pursue in their daughter's memory. The amount wasn't enormous, but it was enough to make David's career change financially feasible. Sarah decided to use this period of transition to become more actively involved in the support group for bereaved parents. Maria had stepped down from her leadership role, and the group needed someone to help coordinate meetings and provide resources for new members. Sarah found that helping other parents navigate their early grief gave her a sense of purpose that had been missing since losing the twins. As David immersed himself in his studies, he began to understand just how complex and rapidly evolving the field of genetic medicine had become. The metabolic disorder that had affected Lily was just one of hundreds of rare conditions that were being newly identified and characterized. Each discovery brought hope for some families while simultaneously highlighting how much medical science still didn't know about genetics and fetal development. His coursework included clinical rotations at various hospitals, where he observed genetic counselors working with expectant parents who faced difficult decisions about high-risk pregnancies. David found these experiences both heartbreaking and inspiring. He met families who chose to continue pregnancies despite knowing their babies would face serious challenges, as well as families who made the difficult decision to terminate pregnancies after receiving devastating genetic diagnoses. One particular case affected David deeply. He was observing a counseling session with a couple whose unborn baby had been diagnosed with the same metabolic disorder that had affected Lily. Unlike his own family situation, this couple had received the diagnosis early enough in the pregnancy to begin planning for specialized treatment immediately after birth. The expectant parents were both terrified and hopeful. The genetic counselor explained that while the condition was serious, advances in treatment meant their child had a good chance of living a relatively normal life with proper medical management. David watched as the couple absorbed this information, seeing in their faces the same mixture of fear and determination that he remembered from his own experience in the NICU. After the session, David spoke privately with the genetic counselor about his own experience with Lily. The counselor was interested in David's perspective as both a student and a parent who had lived through a similar situation. She explained that hearing from parents who had faced these challenges, even when the outcomes were different, helped her better support the families she counseled. This conversation led to an opportunity that David hadn't anticipated. The genetic counseling program began inviting him to share his story with other students as part of their training. David found that talking about Emma and Lily's story in this educational context felt different from the grief-focused conversations he had been having for months. When he shared their story with medical students and genetic counseling trainees, David focused on the medical aspects of the case while also highlighting the importance of compassionate communication with families. He emphasized how Dr. Peterson's honesty and kindness had made an enormous difference during their most difficult moments, and how the support they had received from the medical team had been crucial to their ability to make informed decisions. Sarah attended one of David's presentations and was surprised by how effectively he was able to discuss their daughter's cases in clinical terms, while still honoring their memory as beloved children rather than just medical case studies. She realized that his intensive studying and career change weren't just ways of processing grief. They were genuinely contributing to medical education in ways that might prevent other families from experiencing similar losses. As David's program progressed, Sarah made her own unexpected discovery. While cleaning out some old paperwork, she found the folder of documents from the twins' hospital stay. Among the medical records and insurance forms, she discovered a notebook where she had written daily observations about Emma and Lily during their NICU stay. The notebook contained details she had completely forgotten, small things like which music seemed to calm them, how they responded to different voices, and the subtle differences in their personalities that had emerged even during their brief lives. Sarah realized that these observations, written during her daily vigils at their bedsides, captured aspects of her daughter's lives that no medical records could document. Reading through the notebook, Sarah was struck by how much Emma and Lily had communicated despite their medical fragility. She had noted how Emma seemed to relax when Lily was moved closer to her incubator, and how Lily's vital signs improved when Sarah read stories aloud. These were the behaviors of children who were aware of their surroundings and responsive to love, not simply patients struggling to survive. Sarah brought the notebook to the support group and shared some of these observations with other parents. Many of them had similar stories about their babies' personalities and preferences, details that often got lost in the medical complexity of their situations. The group decided to start encouraging parents to document these personal observations, recognizing that they were creating precious memories that would become increasingly important over time. The notebook also sparked an idea for Sarah. She began writing more detailed accounts of Emma and Lily's story, including both the medical journey and the personal moments that had made them unique individuals. Initially, this writing was purely therapeutic, but she gradually realized that their story might provide comfort and guidance to other families facing similar challenges. As David approached the end of his genetic counseling program, he was offered a position at the same hospital where Emma and Lily had been treated. Dr. Peterson had recommended David for the role, believing that his combination of personal experience and professional training would make him uniquely qualified to help other families navigate genetic diagnoses and treatment decisions. The opportunity felt like coming full circle. David would be working in the same building where his daughters had lived and died, but this time he would be helping other families understand complex medical information and make informed decisions about their baby's care. The position would allow him to honor Emma and Lily's memory, while potentially preventing other families from experiencing similar losses due to delayed or missed diagnoses. Sarah's writing project had evolved into something more substantial than she had originally intended. She had contacted several families from the support group and interviewed them about their experiences with infant loss, creating a collection of stories that highlighted both the medical and emotional aspects of these journeys. Her goal was to create a resource that would help healthcare providers better understand the parent perspective during these crises. The hospital's ethics committee became interested in Sarah's project and invited her to present her findings to medical staff. Her presentation focused on communication strategies that had been most helpful to families, as well as common misconceptions that healthcare providers sometimes had about how parents process information during medical emergencies. One of Sarah's key insights was the importance of acknowledging BAB. 2 years after Emma and Lily's burial, Sarah received a phone call that would bring their story full circle in the most unexpected way. The call came from Dr. Martinez, a pediatric specialist at a children's hospital 3 states away. She had read about Lily's case in a medical journal and had been following the research that had emerged from the twins' story. Dr. Martinez was calling about a baby girl named Sophia who had been born prematurely and was showing symptoms similar to what Lily had experienced. However, because of the new screening protocols that had been developed following Lily's case, they had been able to diagnose Sophia's metabolic disorder within days of her birth. The baby was now responding well to treatment and was expected to live a normal, healthy life. Sophia's parents, Dr. Martinez explained, had specifically requested information about the family whose daughter's case had led to the discovery and treatment protocol that was saving their own child's life. They wanted to express their gratitude and, if possible, to connect with Sarah and David to thank them personally for the role their daughters had played in saving Sophia. Sarah felt overwhelmed by a mixture of emotions as she absorbed this information. The knowledge that Lily's death had directly contributed to saving another baby's life brought both profound joy and renewed grief. She was grateful that Sophia would live, but the reminder of what might have been possible for Lily remained painful, even after 2 years of healing. When Sarah shared the call with David, his reaction was immediate and intense. He wanted to meet Sophia's family, to see for himself the child who had benefited from their daughter's legacy. David had been working as a genetic counselor for over a year now, and he had helped several families navigate similar diagnoses, but this was the first case where the connection to Emma and Lily was so direct and personal. Sophia's family, the Garcias, lived in Denver, and they invited Sarah and David to visit when Sophia was stable enough to meet visitors. The trip represented a significant emotional milestone for both parents. It would be their first time traveling together since the twins' death, and their first time meeting a baby who had survived the condition that had taken Lily's life. The meeting took place at the children's hospital where Sophia was being treated. She was 4 months old now, slightly older than the twins had been when they died, and she was thriving under the treatment protocol that had been developed partly based on Lily's case. Seeing Sophia healthy and alert was both wonderful and heartbreaking for Sarah. Sophia's mother, Carmen, had brought a scrapbook documenting her daughter's medical journey. She showed Sarah and David the genetic test results that had identified Sophia's condition, the treatment plan that had been immediately implemented, and photos documenting Sophia's progress over the past several months. Carmen explained that Sophia's doctors had been able to act quickly because they knew exactly what to look for and how to treat it. Dr. Martinez joined the meeting and provided more detailed information about how Emma and Lily's case had influenced current medical practice. The research generated by their story had been published in multiple medical journals and had been incorporated into training programs for pediatric specialists around the country. The twins' case was now part of standard educational curricula, ensuring that future doctors would be aware of this rare condition. More significantly, the anonymous donor who had funded the original NICU equipment in memory of Emma and Lily had continued to support research into rare metabolic disorders. The foundation established in the twins' honor had funded several research projects and had helped develop the rapid testing protocols that had saved Sophia's life. During the visit, Carmen asked Sarah if she would be willing to share Emma and Lily's story with a support group for parents of children with rare metabolic disorders. Many of the families in this group were dealing with the stress and uncertainty of managing chronic conditions, and Carmen thought that hearing from someone who had experienced the worst possible outcome might provide perspective and strength for their own journeys. Sarah agreed to speak to the group, though she was nervous about discussing her daughter's deaths with parents who were actively fighting to keep their own children healthy. However, when she met with the support group, she discovered that her story provided something these families desperately needed: validation that their fears were real and understandable, combined with evidence that even the worst outcomes could contribute to meaningful change. One mother in the group had been struggling with guilt over her son's diagnosis, wondering if there was something she could have done differently during pregnancy to prevent his condition. Sarah's story helped her understand that genetic disorders were not the result of parental failure, and that even when outcomes were tragic, the love and advocacy that parents provided made a lasting difference. Another father in the group had been angry with the medical system for what he saw as delayed diagnosis of his daughter's condition. Hearing about how Emma and Lily's case had led to improved protocols helped him channel his anger into advocacy rather than resentment, and he began working with the hospital to further improve their diagnostic procedures. As Sarah and David prepared to return home, Sophia's family presented them with a gift that would become one of their most treasured possessions. Carmen had commissioned a local artist to create a small sculpture featuring 4 baby handprints, 2 representing Emma and Lily, and 2 representing Sophia and her twin brother, who had been born healthy. The sculpture was engraved with the words, "Lives Connected Across Time." The trip to Denver marked a turning point in how Sarah and David understood their daughter's legacy. They had always known that Emma and Lily's story was helping other families, but meeting Sophia made that impact tangible and personal. They could see the direct line between their loss and another family's joy, between their daughter's deaths and another child's life. When they returned home, Sarah decided to expand her writing project into a full book about their experience. She wanted to document not just their family's journey, but also the broader impact that one case could have on medical practice and other families' lives. The book would include Sophia's story, as well as accounts from other families who had been helped by the research and protocols developed following the twins' case. David's work as a genetic counselor had also evolved to include training other healthcare providers in communication techniques for families facing genetic diagnoses. He had developed a presentation that included Emma and Lily's story as a case study in how medical information should be shared with families, emphasizing the importance of honesty, compassion, and hope even in difficult circumstances. The second anniversary of the twins' burial was marked by a larger gathering than previous years. Sophia's family traveled to attend the memorial service, along with several families from the metabolic disorder support group and medical professionals who had been influenced by the twins' story. The cemetery that had once seemed like an ending point now felt like the center of an ever-expanding circle of connection and impact. As Sarah stood beside the oak trees that shaded Emma and Lily's grave, she reflected on how their story had grown, beyond anything she could have imagined during those desperate days in the NICU. Her daughters had lived for only a few weeks, but their influence was continuing to expand, saving lives and bringing comfort to families they would never meet. The twins were truly laid to rest now, but their story was very much alive, touching new families and inspiring continued research into the rare conditions that affect the most vulnerable babies. Sarah had learned that some endings are also beginnings, and that love expressed through loss can create ripples of healing that extend far beyond what any family could accomplish in isolation. The shocking moment that had changed everything hadn't been their deaths, but rather the discovery of how their lives continued to matter long after their burial. Emma and Lily Mitchell had become part of something larger than themselves, and their brief presence in the world was creating lasting change that would protect countless other children for generations to come.